Donald Trump thought he knew how this story would go. Slap tariffs on Canada, call them a security threat, rant about them becoming the 51st state, and watch Ottawa crawl back to Washington, begging for access to U.S. markets and U.S. weapons. Instead, something very different just happened. Canada didn't crawl back. It walked to Brussels and signed onto a $150 billion European war fund that is designed to do one thing: rearm Europe, without depending on the United States. For the first time ever, a country outside the European Union, Canada, now has access to that fund. That's roughly $170 billion in EU-backed loans for defense equipment, joint projects, and arms procurement. Prime Minister Mark Carney is selling it as a historic opportunity. But if you look a little closer, it's something else too. It's revenge. Revenge for the tariffs. Revenge for the insults. Revenge for years of sending more than 70 cents of every defense dollar to the US and getting slapped anyway. Tonight on Huge Press Room, we're breaking down how this EU deal actually works, why it's such a slap in the face to Trump, and what it means when America's closest neighbor starts shopping for weapons in Europe instead of the United States. You're watching Huge Press Room. Hit subscribe if you want more deep dives into Trump versus Canada and the power games hiding behind the headlines. And let's get into it. Let's start with what Canada just signed on to. The fund is called SAFE, Security Action for Europe. Think of it as the EU's massive long-term war chest to rebuild its militaries by 2030. Total size about $150 billion, or roughly $170 billion purpose. Give governments and defense companies cheap EU-backed loans so they can buy more missiles, shells, drones, air defenses, ships, and cyber tools. Fast. Context: fear of Russia, fear of Trump walking away from NATO, fear that America first could mean Europe alone in the next crisis. Up to now, SAFE has been for EU members only. Even the UK, with a huge defense industry and a nuclear arsenal, failed to join after a big negotiation collapse over money last week. But Canada gets in. Carney flies to Brussels, stands next to EU leaders, and signs a deal that says, in plain language, Canadian defense companies can tap into this fund. We can build joint projects with European partners. We can access this giant pot of cheap money to buy and build weapons and we don't have to go through Washington to do it. On paper, it's a business move. In reality, it's a geopolitical move. Because for decades, the story was, if Canada wants modern weapons, it goes to the US. F-18s, F-35s, Patriot-style missile systems, US-made drones, US-designed command systems. Carney is now saying no more. Not like that. Not at 70+% of our capital budget. He's not cutting ties with American weapons tomorrow, but he is opening the biggest side door Canada has ever had. And that's where Trump comes in. To understand why this is revenge, you have to go back to how we got here. Trump didn't just annoy Canadians. He gave them a political justification for changing a 70-year habit. In his second term, Trump declared that fentanyl and illegal immigration from Canada and Mexico were a national emergency. Used that emergency to slap 25% tariffs on most Canadian imports and special 10% surcharges on some energy and industrial goods. Publicly joked, and then half-seriously suggested, that Canada should become the 51st U.S. state, as if its sovereignty were a bargaining chip. Those moves didn't just hurt exports. They did something deeper. They broke the old Canadian story that said, as long as we stay close to America, we'll be safe. Carney rode that anger into office on a promise: confront Trump's aggression, diversify trade, and stop sending the bulk of Canada's defense money to U.S. suppliers. The SAFE deal is that promise in treaty form. When Carney stands in Brussels and says no more will over 70 cents of every defense dollar go to the US, he's not just talking to EU leaders, he's talking to Trump. He's saying, you wanted to treat us like a client state. Now we're going to behave like a European ally instead. So what does Canada actually get from this fund? Three big things. First, access to cheap money. SAFE isn't just a political club, it's a 150 billion loan machine backed by EU guarantees. If a Canadian company wants to co-develop a new drone with a German partner, help build an air defense system with France, or manufacture artillery shells with Poland, it can potentially do that with financing subsidized by the EU, not by US banks or US export programs. That makes European projects cheaper and more attractive, compared to buying a finished US system off the shelf. Second, a seat at the design table. SAFE isn't just about buying existing gear, it's about joint development. New drone swarms, new anti-drone systems, new cyber and electronic warfare suites, new generation artillery and missile systems. For Canadian defense firms and engineers, that means you're not just a customer, you're a partner. That's a huge difference from the classic US model where America designs the system, America builds the system, Canada buys the system, and maybe gets some maintenance work on the side. Third, leverage in every other negotiation. This is the part no one is really talking about. When Canada walks into future talks on fighter jet contracts, missile defense, intelligence sharing, or even Trump's tariffs, it can quietly say, "We have options now. We are literally plugged into Europe's rearmament plan. If we don't like the terms from Washington, we know where to look." Leverage isn't about what you use today, it's about what you could use tomorrow. SAFE gives Canada a credible alternative, and that's why this hurts Trump politically. Let's talk about the fighter jet that's become a symbol of this whole pivot. The F-35. For years, Canada has been tangled up in drama over whether to buy the US-built F-35 stealth fighter or go with something like Sweden's Saab Gripen, which has offered local production and maintenance in Canada. The previous government leaned toward the F-35. Carney's government has hit pause and launched a review. He's made it clear that domestic jobs and industrial benefits will be a key factor. Now add the SAFE deal. Suddenly, a European option like Gripen isn't just the other jet. It could be part of a European-Canadian cluster of projects funded and supported under the SAFE umbrella. Shared training, shared maintenance facilities, shared parts inventories, EU-backed loans to build up manufacturing in Canada. For Trump, that's a nightmare scenario. He spent months salivating over the idea of Canadian F-35 contracts as proof that tariffs didn't damage the relationship that much. SAFE throws that into question. At minimum, it gives Canada more bargaining power. If you want us to lock into F-35s for 40 years, you're going to have to move on tariffs, on offsets, on industrial participation, because Europe is on the phone with us right now. At maximum, it could mean we actually don't buy your jets at all. There's another layer, NATO and defense spending. Trump loves to shout that NATO allies don't pay their fair share. For years, Canada has been below the 2% of GDP target on defense. Carney has now promised that Canada will hit that NATO guideline by early next year. But here's the twist. A huge chunk of that new money will now be spent through Europe, not exclusively through the US SAFE projects. Missiles, drones, artillery, cyber, all count towards NATO capability. So when Trump says, "Canada only spends money when I yell at them," Carney can reply, "We are increasing spending, yes, but we're doing it with partners who don't slap illegal tariffs on us and threaten to annex us." He's essentially telling NATO, we'll be a serious military player, just not in the way Trump imagined. Of course, this pivot comes with risks. Europe is not some safe, drama-free alternative. EU defense projects can be slow, bureaucratic, torn between 27 different national interests. SAFE itself is trying to solve that problem by pushing countries to buy together, not separately. But there will be turf wars. France will want French kit. Germany will want German kit. Smaller states will want guarantees they're not just funding the big guys. Canada could easily find itself caught in EU internal fights, frustrated by delays, or squeezed on Made in Europe rules that limit how much work Canadian factories actually get. And don't forget, the SAFE rules say at least 65% of components in these projects have to be produced inside the EU. Canada will need exemptions and carve-outs to make sure it's not just a customer with a fancy badge. If those carve-outs don't come, you could see frustration build quickly in Ottawa and in Canadian industry. So is this move smart strategy or emotional payback? Truth is, it's both. Strategically, it reduces dependence on a single supplier. The US, it embeds Canada in Europe's long-term defense plans. It gives Canadian firms access to projects that could last decades. Emotionally and politically, it lets Carney go home and say, "We are not Trump's client state." It shows Canadian voters he has a plan B that doesn't involve begging for tariff exemptions. And it uses Trump's own behavior as the justification for a shift many in Canada's policy world wanted anyway. For Trump, that's the sting. He can keep the tariffs. He can keep tweeting about the 51st state. But the more he doubles down, the easier it is for Carney to say, "See, this is exactly why we're moving our money to Europe." So I'll leave you with this. Is Carney's SAFE deal a $170 billion revenge play that will actually make Canada stronger and more independent? Or is he trading one dependency for another, swapping Washington's chaos for Brussels' bureaucracy? Is this the moment Canada finally stops being automatically locked into US weapons? Or will the reality of EU politics and Made in Europe rules mean that, in the end, the F-35s and the US contracts still win? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you want to keep following every twist in this story, check out the rest of our series here on Huge Press Room. Carney's Pipeline Revolt, how Canada is trying to escape Trump's tariff trap. From best friend to 51st state, how the relationship hit rock bottom. 25% tariffs. Is Trump forcing Canada to choose Asia over America? Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of Trump versus Canada. Thanks for watching Huge Press Room. I'll see you in the next one.